Welcome to Trivia Box. On this channel, we're going to look at some interesting trivia and some unusual stories from various parts of the world. In the 1960s, 70s and 80s, South Africa was subjected to a sports and cultural boycott due to its policy of racial segregation called Apartheid. What a lot of people at the time might not have been aware of was that many artists broke the cultural boycott to venture into unknown territory and repay the fans that supported them. While many of the mainstream acts of the day refused to tour in South Africa, others braved the wrath of the media and anti-apartheid organizations to take a first-hand look at the pariah state. In this video, we will look at 10 artists that visited South Africa during this period. Number 10. Cliff Richard. Perhaps not that familiar to US audiences, this UK artist was a regular visitor to South Africa in the 60s and 70s. Cliff's visits were a mix of gospel and secular shows, with one of his biggest tours happening in the late 1970s to promote the release of the album Rock and Roll Juvenile, released in the US under the title We Don't Talk Anymore, which was his only UK #1 hit of the 70s. Despite the boycott, Cliff continued to tour South Africa on a regular basis right up until his retirement. Number 9. Percy Sledge. In 1970, US singer Percy Sledge toured South Africa in the wake of his enormous popularity there. After initially only being allowed to perform to mixed-race audiences, the pressure on the nationalist government to allow him to perform to white audiences was granted, provided that the venues were white-only venues. Sledge had hits with When a Man Loves a Woman, My Special Prayer, and Warm and Tender Love, amongst many others. Number 8. Albert Hammond. This may be a name unfamiliar to some, but you will certainly know the songs he's written for other artists, like The Hollies' The Air That I Breathe, Starship's Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, and One Moment in Time by Whitney Houston. In the early 70s, Hammond had his own singer-songwriter career going, with songs like It Never Rains in Southern California and Free Electric Band. Hammond toured South Africa on the back of his Free Electric Band album to huge acclaim there. Like most artists performing in Johannesburg, the designated venue was the beautiful Coliseum Theatre. Number 7. Chris de Burgh. Enormously popular in South Africa, Chris de Burgh burst onto the music scene with his debut album Spanish Train and Other Stories. In 1977, he did a small promotional tour of the country, only performing an acoustic set at Wits University before leaving. He followed with a full national tour 2 years later in 1979, supported by a 5-piece band, with subsequent tours in the 1980s and 1990s. He is probably best known in the US for his 1983 hit Don't Pay the Ferryman. Number 6. Tina Turner. By the time Tina Turner toured South Africa in 1977-1978, visits by black artists from the USA were becoming more and more frequent. People like Lovelace Watkins and Brooke Benton had visited at least twice in the 70s. Tina's career was on the slide when she decided to perform there in 1978. Her tour was a resounding success, and when she returned in 1996 with the demise of apartheid, she was treated with overwhelming gratitude by her fans for her loyalty. Number 5. Van Halen. After the success of their debut album Van Halen and the imminent release of Van Halen 2, drummer Alex Van Halen and singer David Lee Roth embarked on a promotional tour of South Africa in 1979. The two did radio and TV interviews, as well as some impromptu and informal performances in local nightclubs like Johannesburg's Bella Napoli. Sadly, that was the last that any South African fans saw of the band in their home country, as success overtook Van Halen and South Africa failed to feature on their tour roster after that. Number 4. John Lennon. Early in 1980, John Lennon made a fairly incognito trip to South Africa. So effective was his lack of fanfare that in Cape Town he was nearly arrested for vagrancy after falling asleep in a park underneath a tree. By some accounts, he had visited before. This time, however, the news leaked out, but only after he had departed. He also befriended a Cape Town taxi driver who acted as his tour guide, and from the feedback the media received, he was very much in love with the country. Tragically, on December the 9th, 1980, some 11 months after his visit, John Lennon was gunned down in front of his apartment in New York City. Number 3. Frank Sinatra. Never being one for being told what to do, Frank Sinatra performed at Sun City in the parastatal country of Bophuthatswana in 1980. Bophuthatswana, or BOP as it became known, was one of the envisioned countries within a country preferred by the nationalist government as its ultimate climax to its apartheid policies. These countries, often fragmented, were run by black leaders handpicked by Pretoria and often served as a means to circumvent the cultural and other boycotts. Unlike other artists, Frank made no secret of his upcoming performance, sending out his people to check on the venue before committing. His was the first of many controversial performances at Sun City in the 1980s, and as usual, the chairman of the board was well rewarded, this time to the tune of some $2 million.
I did it my way.
Number 2. Queen. Perhaps the most anticipated set of concerts held at Sun City was a series done by supergroup Queen in 1984. The band were booked to the venue for 2 weeks, with concerts held on various days and evenings over that period. Demand was such that another week was added, making for 3 weeks of Queen concerts in the middle of the barren northwest of South Africa. The whole affair created controversy among the band members themselves, with drummer Roger Taylor later professing to have regretted the decision to perform there, and guitarist Brian May vigorously defending it. Regardless of the controversy for the band members, there was no such questioning from the fans, who enjoyed every moment of the groundbreaking event. Before we unveil our number 1 artist, here are a few honourable mentions. Number 1, Eric Clapton, who performed in Swaziland but hobnobbed with local musicians in Johannesburg clubs. Number 2, Leo Sayer, did 2 appearances at Sun City on 2 separate occasions. Number 3, Rick Wakeman, who appeared in Durban in 1981 and later at Sun City. Number 1, Paul Simon. Perhaps the most famous outcome of any artist's visit to South Africa was the Grammy-winning Paul Simon album Graceland. In 1985, Paul Simon somewhat secretly arrived in South Africa with sound engineer Roy Halley to investigate and experiment with black South African music and musicians. He co-opted guitarist Ray Perry, bassist Pakiti Kumalo, and vocal group Ladysmith Black Mambazo, among others, to capture the sounds he wanted for his new album. While in Johannesburg, he was sorely tempted to perform at the University of the Witwatersrand's annual Free People's Concert, standing backstage with his guitar during the performances while trying to decide whether or not to perform. Eventually, deciding not to, he nevertheless created a storm of controversy over his visit, facing raging criticism from anti-apartheid activists and artists. Ironically, this all happened at a time when apartheid was on the decline in South Africa, with Nelson Mandela being released from prison 4 years after the release of Graceland. I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of South African music history. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel by clicking the subscribe button below.